Welcome back, everybody, to the Radical Moderate Podcast. I am your host, Pat O'Brien, and today I am joined by one of my closest friends in the world, Scott Davis. Welcome to the podcast.
Man, thanks for having me on.
So let me frame it here a little bit so people understand why is Pat having his friends on the podcast. We have a nickname. We call ourselves the Restaurant Razorback Blood Brothers. There's a history for that. I'm going to let you get into it here in a minute. But I want to kind of tell the audience, the thing about us is we're kind of an odd couple, but we've got these things that are like super similar about each other. And then we have these things that are very, very different about, where we came from and how we grew up. So to start off with, we're both from Arkansas, grew up here and all that, but you're from Heber Springs, which is a town 6,000-7,000 people. I'm from Jacksonville, which is a town of 30,000, but in the big county next to Little Rock. We're both the sons of restaurant people. So my dad was a McDonald's guy. Your dad was and still is a Sonic guy. We both worked in our businesses as teenagers, but then I end up coming up to Northwest Arkansas and going to college and law school at the University of Arkansas. You end up doing a little bit extra higher ed, but kind of quickly go to, man, I can just do better just going straight to work and trying to build a business empire up. And then just personal stuff, people who know me, I was single my whole life until just not quite 2 years ago at this point. You got married really young. Then you get into stuff like you grew up where guns and your dad teaching you how to use guns is very common. Me, not at all. But kind of the big thing, and the reason why I wanted to have you on today is when we started to get to know each other, we quickly realized from a political standpoint, we had really different opinions. I'm a radical moderate, but I'll just say I was kind of a center left and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you were coming at things kind of from a very pro-Trump type perspective. So that's the frame. Why don't you go back and tell everybody, like, why do you think we became friends? How the hell did that happen?
Now, I think we found out. I tell people all the time I could lose everything tomorrow, and I know that you would have my back, and I've always felt like even though we may differ on some political views, some policy issues. We still have so much in common. And, I always tell people, especially whether it's, especially in a conservative world, or even if I'm, talking to somebody a little bit more liberal, I always use us as an example of, almost it should be the example that the country is led with, in my opinion, these days, and being willing to have conversations, even if they're tough conversations where we're polar opposites on our opinions on that subject, we can still do it in a respectful manner, and not tearing down the other one, because we still love each other, at the end of the day, and I think that's what's made our relationship so special over the years.
I agree, and to me, and I don't know if you put it the same exact time frame, but it was the summer of 2018. The Arkansas Razorback baseball team got to go to the College World Series in Omaha. It was the finals. And I don't know if I called you or you called me, but we were constantly communicating. And I just said, hey, I got a place to stay and can figure out tickets. Do you want to just jump in a car and go? And you're like, yeah. And so for people that don't know how the College World Series works, it's not like the Super Bowl. You don't know when it's going to be. In terms of, you don't know if your team's going to make it. I guess there's that. You have very little notice. So we just jumped in the car, and it's probably like maybe a 9-hour drive both ways. We spend it, I think, like Sunday night we got home on a Friday so we spent a lot of time together. And we're talking about Sonic, which is how we got to know each other. But then you kind of run out of things business-wise to talk about. And so I think that's when I remember first having those conversations. I don't know if you remember it differently or the same.
No, absolutely. And, starting with the Razorbacks, which I don't think do enough of the winning, but we love to win.
Yeah.
And you know, and I think that's you know, again, when we talk about our political thoughts and views and where we want to see our country, you know, we don't know what it's going to be like, you know, 6 months from now, 4 years from now, whatever. But at the end of the day, we want to win. And, you know, again, that's where I think we've got to have, you know, be able to have those conversations and, to, you know, to get to that spot where we are.
Well, and I think, you know, we'll probably talk about Sonic a little bit later, but to kind of go to the heart of the matter, and I don't, you know, I've grown up around people who I would generally say identify with the Democratic Party, people who are probably center left to liberal. And that, I think you just become, that's your friend group, you know, that's who you're hanging around with. And of course, I was a political candidate. So those were the people who were supporting me, financing my campaign and all that. It's just natural, I think, that you're going to gravitate toward that, whether it's your tribe or how you want to describe it. I think for me, what was unique was after politics, then I get into Sonic, and just generally speaking, I think more the Sonic franchisees tend to be more conservative, which is not a big surprise. So you and I think, were jiving mainly on talking about the business and how to do that stuff, and then realized, probably out of curiosity, like, hey, you know, you think about this differently, and why is that the case? So when I say I want to go to the heart of the matter, and I gave you a heads up on this, so we're not, you know, throwing a curveball at each other, but I thought about like how to explain to people who might, let's just kind of use broad terms of people who are a Democrat, or you could call them more progressive / liberal, versus people who, starting back in say 2015, 2016, would proudly identify themselves as very Trump supportive, MAGA, Make America Great. You and I, if you want to put us into each other buckets, I'm more on the person who's the Democrat, center left progressive. You're more the Trump MAGA. So what I think we've come to here in this country in too many relationships is, hey, I'm going to now judge that other person. And I'm going to say, well, if you voted for Joe Biden, I now know everything about you. I know how everything works, and vice versa. If you will put on that red hat and you say I voted for Trump, I know everything about you. I don't think that's true, but I think that's kind of where we're at. But then you start breaking that down. And to me, I want to focus on one thing and get your take on it first. And that goes back to the 2020 elections. And just, I don't think anybody's surprised, but I've never voted for Donald Trump, but at 16, 2024, never voted for him. But I hoped in 2016, and I hope now in his second term that he does well for the country. But in 2020, he loses. My take on it is he says that there was fraud, and he says, the election wasn't an accurate reflection of what really happened. I really won the presidency. There's something like 50 or 55 lawsuits where he's going to court saying, you know, see it my way, and none of them did. And then you get to January 6th, which was the day that they're going to certify the vote. My take on it, Scott, is that he was in the wrong, and he kind of egged people on to storm the Capitol, and then he was really putting it all on Mike Pence, saying, do the right thing. Is like, what do you mean do the right thing? Like, I'm certifying the election. That's my job. And then at a minimum, in my opinion, when the crowd was getting out of control, I think he was slow to respond. I think he was slow to call it the National Guard, et cetera. I think it was really, really, really bad, really kind of disqualifying. That's certainly how I felt then. You're going to have a different take, and I want to hear that, and I think the audience wants to hear it. How do we even talk about this, and how do we still be friends when we probably are going to have a different take on this? But give me your take.
Well, I mean, obviously it's an event in the country that you never wanted to happen. You know, I think from the conservative point of view with it though too, we're going through a crazy time with COVID and an excess of mail-in votes. When I talk to a lot of conservatives, it's not it's not that they feel like that even necessarily Donald Trump won that election. It was just there was different things going on there. You know, perception can become reality, whether that's a real thing or not. We've seen things like, you know, some censorship of if you remember, even of Trump and you know the social platforms when he's pulled off of Twitter, they're you know taking his comments down. In fact, even recently we've seen, you know, with the BBC, and I know he's had lawsuit after lawsuit going after these people, but literally taking things that he said on that day and editing the video to where it was literally it comes out completely different. And you know, and so I think that, you know, I think that's I think what the regular average Joe voter, which I think if you took a poll, number one, I think, you know, with Donald Trump and people that have voted for him since back in, I guess since we're over a decade now,
right?
You know, it's almost one of those things that people are kind of scared to even tell you that's who they voted for,
right?
You know, and in my personal opinion, I don't think it should be like that in the country, and so I think, you know, again, I try to be objective, whether it's not that I'm a MAGA, you know, I'm going to, you know, I believe everything Donald Trump says, everything he does, but if I'm being real on what draws me to it is simply I think I like his policy better than what the alternative was, and I think he can relate with the average American more than what we've seen, and you know, with some of these other candidates on the other side, and so yeah, I think that's that was kind of my takeaway from it, and you know, and then you thought it was the end of Donald Trump, in fact, a lot of Republicans would have told you that, but it was one of those things where I think, you know, we've seen it with you know, the 34 felonies and the, I mean, it was literally, it's almost, you know, it comes across, I think, again, this perception that can turn into reality of there is, whatever it is, an establishment or a group of people that this guy, they're trying to get rid of him. And, you know, and then I think that became even more polarizing as we go into, you know, then the 4 years under President Biden, and you know, and then we get during the election, Donald Trump almost gets, you know, assassinated.
Yeah, and let me on that point, on the assassination stuff, and I talked about this in the previous episode. That was the low point of it all, and right. In terms of whether or not I agree with you that, you know, he is a martyr and that all of the things that were brought against him were wrong. I think there's a debate about that. I think you could see that both ways. I've said this before. I am so happy that bullet didn't. I know that we're talking about Butler. I'm so glad that the bullet grazed him instead of hit him and killed him, because that would have been just horrendous. And regardless of what you think about him as a president with his policies, regardless of what you think about him as a person and the things he says, that I think you transform. You don't want anybody murdered, right, ever. But when you are a former president and then now again president, you are representing the country, and that is terrible for our country. And so, and I don't hang out with anyone who would have cheered that on or made shitty comments like, you know, I wish the bullet would hit him. But I did see stuff like that, you know, and I'm like, come on, guys, like that's out of bounds. Like you can't. It's kind of like the Charlie Kirk thing. It was a tragedy. It was just a tragedy, and this, like, leave it at that. But then some people piled on, and like, you know, were happy about it, and I can't deal with that. Like, that's nonsense to me.
Well, and I think, and back to, you know, again, where we've been at with Trump, you know, and leading the country, you know, we've seen what happened with just what you're saying there with Charlie Kirk, that if I had to speculate and guess, we would have seen the same thing if Donald Trump would have been killed that day. I think there would have been celebration.
You think it would,
Oh, I think there'd have been a group of a percentage of, again, it's just how polarizing politics, I think, has become in this country. We are trained, and it's, in a sense, whether it's how we were raised in the circle that we're around there, or when we go to school, or we're going to college, or, whatever it is, we're probably going to gravitate a little bit more towards what we're around, that as opposed to being, if we're something completely different from that, we're kind of the outcast now.
yeah.
So I think politically in our country, the disappointing thing for me is, when I look at it from a global perspective, is it's almost like we're supposed to hate the other side so bad that we'll take the least bad option.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're looking for. Probably a big, chunk of the country that, and I'm even, guilty of this some, where I don't know all the ins and outs and everything about that candidate, but if it's got the R by it, then I'm going, all right, well, just click that one off. And I think it's something that we've got to be, we got to be able to have conversations in this country and on both sides of the aisle. And then I think we've got to be a little bit more subjective of what, even if it's on our side, what are they doing? And, and do I agree with that, or do I want to see it go in a different way? And the final thing I'll say, man, is, we've got to the point where there's so much money involved. It's almost like whoever's the least bad candidate that has the most money behind them and the best marketing strategy is probably going to win the president. You could be the best candidate for president in 2028, but you would probably never would get there because you don't have the massive money behind you. You don't have the marketing campaign behind you that's going to take you, to the top. I'll use an example even with Asa Hutchinson. I think a lot of conservatives look at Asa as, kind of a more centered, conservative that's going to have some more liberal thoughts and stuff. You'd have thought that guy would have got a lot of votes in the last presidential election, but there's not that same kind of money and support behind it.
Well, and I think, just on that point, we're in a business with brands, and you're in Sonic, you're in Slim Chickens. And so a brand is a thing you're comfortable with. It's something that you're familiar with. You want to keep going back to, and we're of course incentivized to want to keep our customers. And so the Democrats are incentivized to want to keep their loyal followers and voters, and vice versa with the Republicans. So one of the things I want to go back to, just because make sure we close the loop, what I was trying to say earlier about January 6th is that for me, it was a seminal moment. And I don't know if you remember, but we were on the phone with each other, or we were talking that day. COVID, you're right, COVID was still going on. I was at my home office. We were talking about something else. And then I just stopped you and said, hey, are you seeing what's going on at the Capitol? And your initial reaction was like, yeah, it's like a little protest. And in my opinion, you were kind of, maybe you hadn't seen enough coverage or whatever, but you were like, it didn't seem like a big deal. Then about an hour later, I got a text from you like, hey, I've started watching, this is a problem. This needs to be fixed. And for me, I'm never going to get over it in terms of I'm going to lay that at the feet of Donald Trump. I think he's responsible for that. Now, what I will say is the majority of the American public got over it because they voted for him in 2024. I didn't get over it, but I got over the fact that, he's the president. I'm not saying that he didn't win in 24. He obviously did. I want to just ask you, though, are you saying that you think his role in it has been maybe over dramatized, or are you saying, look, maybe he didn't have the best he didn't do the right things on that day, but I'm just looking past that to the bigger picture of what I think he can do as president. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I don't agree with what happened on that day, and and I'm not President Trump's spokesperson. I would have recommended some different, saying some different things and a little bit different rhetoric, and obviously he ended up coming out of it, and 4 years later he's the president again. So I'd make the argument I've told you before on the Democrat side, it might have been better off if he would have won that first one, and you'd really, as a lot of them would say, turn the page. But no, I think again, from when you look at the public and again, perception can become reality. That was a terrible day. I think you had a lot of Republicans condemn that day, but then we also seen it then weaponized and exaggerated. And I think when you see that again, even if Donald Trump was in the wrong in a lot of things that day, when you see things edited, when you see things, we're going to weaponize it. We're going to take him out. In essence, I'm not saying that they were responsible for getting him almost assassinated or
right.
Whatever there, but I think it's a good example of how we've got to be able to change the tone and how we're having these conversations in our country today, because and I'm big for we should always have the right to peacefully protest. And I think we've seen that on both sides. I'm not okay with what happened on January 6th, but I'm also not okay with things that I've seen happen in Minnesota or all these other things that are not okay. And you see on the conservative side, they're called Hitler and you're racist and you're all
right.
Not say those things I'm sure exist in our country, but I think we're at a point in society today where I think we're making a little bit bigger of a deal out of it than what that really is today, and talking about a smaller group that is really probably, if we really knew the nuts and bolts behind it, probably so small and minimal that we really shouldn't be devoting a lot of our time to it.
Well, I'll move on from, at least in this podcast, from January 6th. And because to me, what I wanted to actually do is redirect and say, and I've tried to tell this to my friends, we'll just call, liberal to progressive sort of thing. It was bad, but Donald Trump is just going to say that his role was small in it and this sort of thing. And like, that's fine. I mean, and so he got elected again, and that was kind of the final judgment. My fear, and I've tried to describe it this way, that there's, let's say, a 5% chance that this is going to happen. So that's a low chance, but it's higher than zero, is that we're going to get to the 2026 midterms and Donald Trump is somehow going to try to alter those, whether he suspends them or just declares from the beginning they're fraudulent. Like, I think there's a chance that's going to happen, and I think there's not going to be any evidence to really prove it. Now, I'm saying 5%, which, I mean, if I tell you there's a 5% chance of happening, you're like, so you're thinking the odds are pretty low. I'm like, yeah, of course. On the other hand, it used to be 0% chance of the odds of something like that. We'll see, right? So you shouldn't live life with fear of something that may never happen. But I just want to get on the record with you. If he says, hey, we got to suspend the elections, or you're like, no, it's in the Constitution. We got to follow the Constitution. That's where I'm going to be at it. And I would hope that you would be like, okay, Mr. President, like, come on, man. Like, we can't go that far.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, I'll tell you we're talking about fear on both sides. If we talk,
what are you scared of? What's your fear?
I'll just tell you, like I said, on the conservative side there, I think you would probably say the same stats and percentages on people that were worried that mail-in ballots we're going to rig the election, or massive amounts coming in, or illegals voting, or I think that's a good example of it. Under Kamala and Joe Biden for that 4-year stretch, I think we can both agree as a Republican and a Democrat that immigration got out of line. And it's something that's something that, in my opinion, has always been able to be a pretty bipartisan thing. But same deal, there's the fear on the conservative side that Well, we got 7 or 8 states that they're not requiring voter ID, or we're going to have all these fraudulent votes come in. Again, I'm back to the perception sometimes can become reality in our minds. And so I think that, for the way I look at that, from both sides of the spectrum, I hear what you're saying as far as you definitely don't want a third term of Donald Trump, and you're definitely ready to turn the page after 2. But yeah, I think that's something that, I just don't think that's going to be something that we'll be talking about.
And maybe it's a 1% chance, which is very, very low. I'm just telling you, I don't think it's 0. And I do take your point.
Hell, there's probably 1% chance that it's Barack Obama versus Donald Trump for the 2028 presidency.
Well, I'll say this: if they, what they could legally do, the people who support Donald Trump, what they could legally do is they could change the Constitution, saying that you can run for more terms. And I think Donald Trump really hates Barack Obama. I think a lot of this really started back when it was at that dinner, the correspondence dinner, and he made fun of him, and I think he hurt his ego. And not to say like that's a great reason to run for president, but there's a history in this world of trying to tell someone, you can't ever be an actor, or you can't build a company, and you put a big chip on somebody's shoulder, giving them that motivation. I wish President Obama hadn't done that. I really do. I don't. And by the way, we're got a couple minutes left, so kind of summarize some of your. I appreciate you doing this. Kind of summarize some of your thoughts, though. Are you, for our audience, would you say I'm a MAGA guy, or would you say no? I got a lot of MAGA friends, and I respect some things. Or you say, man, it's mostly about the policy, but I do understand you have to win an election, and that's like a logo, right? I mean, it's just a way to get people interested.
No, I definitely wouldn't consider myself just the MAGA guy, or even that in general at all. I look at policy things. I look at a guy like Ron DeSantis running Florida, that from the outside looking in, it looks like he's doing a hell of a job. I look at a guy like Marco Rubio, that's Secretary of State. Whether you like him or not, he's going around the world, and now he may be kind of the iron fist sometimes in how he's dealing diplomatically with some of these people and foreign leaders. But I think there's respect there, So I'll look at things like that. I'll just, back to a guy like Donald Trump, he's probably not the. I would agree with you, not the most qualified candidates that we've ever had to be president of the United States. Well, I think what the draw to him was that this is a big time business person that we've never had one necessarily lead our country, and maybe he can place big time people around him that can get us good results. And then the final thing I'll say, man, our human instinct is when we're told no, we want to do the opposite. Whenever I'm putting Clark to bed at night and he wants something and I say no, he's going to be upset, and he's probably going to try to do the opposite. And so, to summarize it, I think that's how the American public looked at Donald Trump was, you tell me no, that I cannot vote for him or he cannot be the president. Well, this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah, I never thought about it that way, but that's kind of just straight human psychology. There was a lot of, I think, attempts to shame and say, in those early days, and just say, if you vote for Donald Trump, you're a bad person. And now, looking back retrospectively, that was probably the worst thing you could have done if you really didn't want Donald Trump to get elected, for sure. Well, I think we laid it out kind of in a good way here, and I hope. Man, this, like, I don't always know who's listening. I don't know what they're listening for, but the takeaway I'm hoping that people get is I hope that, like, they already have someone in their life who they really do. It could be a family member or a high school classmate or whatever, and they enjoy doing stuff with them, but maybe. So that's kind of the basis, but maybe they've shied away because they think they can't talk politics. I would just hope, if there's no other takeaway from this, like, you and I do it all the time. And I mean, there's been times where I'm like, all right, Scott, you're trying to sell me on something here. I'm not buying. But you'll like, well, defend your position, Pat, and I'll give you the
Right.
why I'm doing it. And then you'll listen. And if you think it's good, you'll take heed. If you think I'm full of it, you'll call me out. So unfortunately, on this particular episode, we've run out of time. So we're going to come back for folks who listen this week. We're going to come back part 2. I don't even know what we're going to talk about part 2. But for this week, I want to thank everyone for listening to the POV of POB.